Hello and welcome to another episode of Attacking Third, a CBS Sports soccer podcast. I'm Sandra Herrera, lead NWSL writer for CBS Sports, joined today, as always, by my colleague and co-host Lisa Roman, NWSL analyst and broadcaster. On today's episode, we're continuing our NWSL 2022 team-by-team previews, and today we're going to take a deep dive into the Chicago Red Stars. But first, a quick reminder to follow us on Twitter for all breaking news at Attacking Third. If you're listening to this as a podcast, please give us a 5-star rating and review. It takes just a second and it really helps us out. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, the 5-star rating and review page, and on Spotify right on the Attacking Third page. Go ahead and give us those 5 stars and help us out. Lisa, we're going to do it. We've arrived. We're going to chat about Chicago Red Stars. How you doing today?
I'm good. I love doing these previews, but I've come to the conclusion and the realization doing these previews that my favorite part is actually talking to the players, which I know that about myself. I love to do interviews and I love to talk to people and ask them questions and hear their answers and find out stories from them. So that is hands down my favorite part, that we get to do player interviews along with our previews. It just gives a different perspective on the team and the preview for that team that we're diving into. And for Chicago, we do have another preview coming up at the end of this episode. It will be in the second half that I'm really excited about. But that's my favorite part of this. But Sandra, how are you doing? How's it going? How is life?
Listen, I'm doing okay. The month of February has brought snow to the city of Chicago. It's been coming in and out in waves. So it's not February for me if it's not like gray and
Yeah.
cold and kind of has some type of snow or sleet combination, if I'm being quite honest. So it just
And
it just
and you
feels like
guys just
home.
got hit pretty hard.
Yeah, I know. It's like, come on now. So it just felt right. I think it just felt right for us to say, hey, let's do the Chicago Red Stars preview while it's like still, this type of weather going on. Hopefully, it's not an omen of any sort. But I'm excited to jump into all of this with you.
Me too. Me too. I hate to brag about this, but subtle Philadelphia brag, we're like 60 right now. It's beautiful. I love
Yeah,
this.
the other day, we had our like 50-degree day in February. So of course, like once that happens, it's like, boom, just to remind you, you're in February, and then it
Yeah.
comes, and then all this other like garbage
The
comes from the sky.
the
It's so
cold
funny.
is so much colder after you have the 50, 60-degree day that the winds hit you. They hit you hard.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. The winds hit you, they hit you hard. Let's transition with that. Talking about Chicago Red Stars. Let's get into a team overview real quick. Maybe sort of recap what happened in the off season for this team as we break down a preseason roster eventually. For right now, Chicago Red Stars have an acting head coach. Been fluctuating between the terminology between interim and acting, and right now is acting head coach Rade Tanaskovic. He's been with the team for 3 seasons as a goalkeeper coach, but he stepped in as acting head coach during the offseason, really. Had to navigate the team through some events, whether it was like a expansion draft that they ended up trading themselves out of, and then an eventual 2021 NWSL draft. The Chicago Red Stars had that on their radar during their offseason, Lisa, saying, hey, we're going to continue a head coaching search. And they gave a timeline on themselves for January, and then they gave another update saying that actually this is still ongoing and we're going to move forward for right now while we continue a search with the acting coaching staff in place, which includes Teniskovic and includes former Red Star Julian Stitch and now additional assistant coach in Fabrice Gatra as well.
Lots of different coaching changes, and it's important to note that through all of this coaching change in Chicago, it was initially announced in December that they would have a head coach by the end of January and the start of February preseason. That time frame has come and gone. The front office did put out a statement saying that were in a search and they were looking to find someone that was qualified enough to lead this club and that the players deserved. So they start their preseason with just an acting head coach. I know that as players, they go in and they're excited to play and they just want to get better, and it doesn't necessarily matter. But as like a culture of a club and a culture of a team laying that foundation, it's really tricky not to have a set head coach at the start of preseason. And even if Rada steps in there and becomes the full-time head coach, which I don't really think that's going to happen, as he's a goalkeeper coach. He's not a full head coach. It's a very different thing to be specialized in a certain position versus overseeing a head coach or even a first assistant. So that changes the mindset a little bit, and the tone and the vibe of the club and trainings and preseason, almost a bit like disorganized. And I know they have a lot going on, but really that's how it seems as an outsider looking in, and that perspective that there's a lot of turmoil happening there, and no one is really saying, okay, I'm going to step in and I'm going to take control and take charge of this situation.
Yeah, I mean, and that goes alongside with, making any other notable hires, during the off season, which, in light of not having an actual new official head coach to put into place while preseason kicked off, they did announce the hiring of an associate general manager and former Chicago Red Stars player Michelle Lomnicki, and they talked about her experiences as well. She was with the team during some of this off season where it saw a lot of player movement, well, where they had to navigate a double expansion draft and an NWSL draft. And this is really the first of its kind type of position for this team. Before, in the past, that the role of full general manager was kind of a dual title alongside the head coaching title. And for a long time, the decade that Chicago Red Stars have been in existence in NWSL, those responsibilities typically fell on the former head coach, in Rory Dames as GM and coach of the club. So sort of having an additional component to go along with the front office, with the administrative level that's in place right now with this coaching staff, to sort of have another outlet, and a former player at that, to sort of be able to help be this almost kind of buffer, right, between these deals, or for the players who are currently in place, as the team tries to really move forward. Because this is a club who, in their off season, Lisa, let's be frank, we've had to come on this show and talk about a lot of negative headlines around this club.
Yes, we have. And sticking with on the pitch, I mean, you have to look at how they did in 2021. They were runners up in the NWSL championship. They lost to Washington Spirit in that final championship game, but they finished the regular season fourth. So solidifying their spot in the playoffs, as it was an expanded playoff system this year in 2021 for the first time, 6 teams making it, and Chicago solidifying that for what, almost the 7th postseason in a row for Chicago. So they have that winning mentality, and they have that culture there, that they get to the playoffs and they make it as far as they can. And honestly, dagger in the heart that they haven't won a championship yet, because they have had a lot of postseason success making it into the playoffs. But I think adding former players into the front office and kind of shifting around some of the responsibilities will help even things out on the pitch, as it's a trickle down effect, but it's not going to happen overnight. So 2021, they finished the regular season fourth, made it all the way to the NWSL championship before falling to Washington Spirit. And then in our way too early power rankings that we did in December, right at the end of the 2021 season, we put Chicago finishing number 8. So out of playoff contention. This was before a lot of moves were made. I think we did this maybe knowing that 1 or 2 moves had already been happened. And at this point, former head coach Rory Dames had resigned. So we gave them a number 8. We'll see if that holds for 2022 as we really dive deeper into all of the changes that Chicago made in the offseason.
We got to talk about maybe their transfer window, right? In light of a double expansion draft, in terms of breakout roster signings for this team, there is not a lot that they can hang their hat on in terms of what was arguably the most active offseason in NWSL history. So for Chicago, based on their offseason, they're going to see a lot of new faces, right, in terms of acquisitions, and in terms of an acquisition that didn't come via the draft. Their only acquisition, that player acquisition they can point to, is in a former player that requested to come back to the Chicago Red Stars. And forward Yuki Nagasato, the Japanese international,
For personal
returning.
reasons
Yeah,
too. For personal
returning
reasons, she wanted to
returning
come
for
back to
personal
Chicago.
reasons. Yeah, let's acknowledge that, the celebration of an engagement,
Yes.
right? So
But it wasn't because she wanted to necessarily be with the Chicago Red Stars. It was like, I'm starting a life. I'm engaged. I want to be where my fiance is and my family is in Chicago. It's
yeah.
just important to have all the details, Sandra.
I mean, that's important to bring up when we're looking at how or the lack how there's a lack of player acquisition for this team in this off season. So Nagasato, a former Red Star player who had spent time with the club since 2017, since she was a player that they acquired then, right, in terms of an international signing, and then departing a little bit to Racing Louisville FC for their inaugural season, and now coming back to the Red Stars. So not a lot there in terms of what we're looking at, what could be their biggest off-season acquisition or their biggest roster signing in the offseason heading into 2022. They've got a number of draft picks that will kind of be in the mix, whether it's Brianna Alger, Haley Van Fossen, Channing Foster, Jill Aguilera, kind of stemming from the 2021 draft. Ava Cook, Samantha Fisher, Sarah Griffin, Kayla McCann, Jada Hilton Pelea coming in from the 2022 draft. So a lot more new faces, right? When we're looking at off-season additions versus maybe experienced players or other international players. In terms of the biggest losses, before we get into that, there's like a little window where Chicago did some re-signings, Lisa. It's like it's not necessarily going out and getting player acquisitions, but it is saying, hey, these are players that we want to make sure are that they're retained with the Chicago Red Stars. And they did it by issuing contracts to 4 United States women's national team caliber players.
They did. It's not necessarily that they got them, but they're keeping them for a little bit longer. So I guess congratulations. I mean, it's congrats to these players and for everything they've done. Defender Tierna Davidson, defender Casey Krueger, goalkeeper Alyssa Nair, forward Mallory Pugh. They all signed multi-year contracts to stay in Chicago, stay with the Red Stars, and continue playing. Having all of these players, I mean, 4 of them right there, but a number of players for Chicago that do compete at the national team level. It also kind of shines a light onto our international spotlight, which I know we usually talk about later in these previews, but knowing that there are a lot of U.S. women's national team players on this roster means that they're missing for a chunk of the season. And we saw that happen in 2021. I mean, Julie Ertz was injured for a majority of the season, but she didn't play, and she was also with the Olympics. Also, Alyssa Nair, she got injured in the Olympics, which then took her out for the rest of the Chicago season. So it does play a trickle-down effect factor, but they did re-sign these players. I don't know if it counts as a new signing and a new acquisition when we kind of hang our hat on that one, but they are back and they're staying for multi-year contracts in Chicago, which I think is really good. If you're a fan of Chicago, you like to see that these names are sticking around for a little bit longer.
Silver linings, I guess, before we get into probably their biggest losses, right? Which has sort of felt like something that we were keeping track of more actively than perhaps biggest additions. In terms of the biggest losses for this team over the course of the offseason, they said farewell to defender Sarah Gorden at Angel City, along with Julie Ertz as well. Nikki Stanton was sent off in a trade to OO Reign, and then players Mackenzie Doniak, Kelsey Turnbow, and 2021 draft pick Kelsey Turnbow and Katie Johnson were sent to San Diego Wave as well. So we're talking a number of players here, from players who have been with the team for X amount of years, right? It varies. Some players with the team since 2014, 2016, to what was considered really, Lisa, perhaps a future piece, right? For Chicago, but some big losses here for you. Who stands out the most in terms of the biggest losses for Chicago this offseason?
These are a lot of losses. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, I don't think Chicago won this offseason by any means. They did not gain a lot of players. They re-signed some of their consistent ones, but they also lost really, really big pieces in their playing style. I mean, A lot of people, I think, when you glance at this, will make a huge argument for Julie Ertz, even Sarah Gorden, but for me, when I look at this list of players lost, forward Katie Johnson heading to San Diego Wave is the biggest one for Chicago. She wasn't always a starter. She wasn't getting on the stat sheet every single game. She wasn't scoring the most goals for this team, but Katie Johnson was a very consistent player in the front line for Chicago. She was almost that role player. So if they needed her to come in off the bench and add that spark at a different dimension, she could also really complement the play of Mallory Pugh up top, Kalia Watt up top, and just complement them, whether it was playing on the left side, playing on the right side, playing that center striker, and just doing as a role player, she played her role very, very well. And when you look at Chicago's roster, especially in 2021, they didn't have a lot of depth at their forward position. Or rather, if they did on the roster, they didn't have a lot of experienced depth and depth that you could put on the field, start them, and they would make an impact. And Katie Johnson was an impact player in any role that she played. She would contribute. She would hold her own. She was a consistent player. She stayed relatively healthy throughout the season, which is a huge factor. So no, she's maybe not the biggest loss that would step out to a lot of people right off the bat when they read this list. But for me, looking at the ups and downs of a team throughout the entirety of a really long season, Katie Johnson is a depth role player that will be a huge, huge loss for Chicago in 2022. Now, Sandra, for you, is there what stands out to you in these losses? Because there were a lot of losses for Chicago.
Yeah, I think you can honestly go through each of these players who made their departure and maybe make a case, right, for each one. I'm hearing you loud and clear on your case for Katie Johnson. I would agree with you, and that the forward line had some, was maybe thin even in 2021, but we know for sure it's going to be that in 2022, and to lose Katie Johnson is going to be significant for this team that is kind of be going to be struggling maybe for forward depth. But I'm going to be going on the defensive line of things here for Sarah Gorden to Angel City. I think an important thing to note is a lot of these moves that we saw in the departures. The Red Stars made it a point to emphasize that a lot of these were to help accommodate player requests, right? Which I think you can maybe look at one way or the other. You could say, oh, Chicago is trying to be bold and brave and honor player requests to move. And the other side of that is, why are players coming to you and
Yeah.
asking to leave, right? So there's like a double-edged sword here, right? Especially when you're looking like me at the defensive line of things in somebody like Sarah Gorden to Angel City. While yes, there's a number of defenders on to the Chicago Red Stars teams who could probably slot in and have add the depth that a player like Gorden will leave behind in terms of a whole. That's not necessarily true when we're looking at things kind of holistically. And that's how I'm looking at things. When we're looking at this offseason that this team had, which they had a ton of, negative, headlines around the team in regards to their former head coach, when the almost looks like flood of the flooding through the gates for players leaving, asking for, requests to leave the teams and, citing different reasons. That signals to me that whatever happens in 2022, there's going to be a little bit of an adjustment. Now, whether they want to call it a rebuild, whether they want to call it a retool, whether they want to call it, a new era, whatever, you're going to have to, sort of reestablish yourself, not just on the pitch, but off of it as well. So when you're talking about losses, I don't think we could just talk about losses positionally. I think we have to talk about that in terms of club culture and well. And when we're looking at a player like Sarah Gorden's absence of this team, this is a player that did so much for this team on the pitch, picking up Iron Woman, right, coming off of that iconic 2021 season. So it's not just doing it on the pitch for this team, but it was
Yeah.
off of the pitch as well. So she brought a lot in the locker room in terms of the community as Chicago native. So I'm with you in terms of the two biggest ones. A lot of people might say a Julie Ertz, right, in a big heavyweight player like that, or maybe even a future piece in Turnbow. But I'm with you in terms of NWSL experience for Katie Johnson and on and off the pitch experience for Sarah Gorden for this team. In terms of the preseason roster, Lisa, let's take a look at the preseason roster that Chicago put out and maybe go through some things here, right? Because there's some edits and adjustments that we are going to have to make along the way. For goalkeepers, they have Alyssa Nair, Cassie Miller, Emily Boyd, and Bridget Skiba. They have for defenders 13, listing Brianna
Ooh.
Alger, Tanner Davidson, Jada Hilton Pelea, Casey Krueger, Amanda Kowalski, McKenna McCannis, Tatum Malazzo, Zoe Morse, Kayla Sharples, Bianca St. George's, Aaron Wright, Haley Van Fossen, and Tierney Wiltshire. For the midfielders, listing 8 with Danny Colaprico, Vanessa DiBernardo, Samantha Fisher, Morgan Gautrat, Kayla McKeown, Regan Steglager, Ella Stevens, Sarah Waldmore. And then for forwards, they have 12 listed with Jill Aguilera, Ava Cook, Channing Foster, Jasmine Grant, Sarah Griffin, Madison Haley, Rachel Hill, Sarah Luber, Alyssa Motts, Yuki Nagasato, Mallory Pugh, and Kalia Watt. So a lengthy preseason roster, right? With, let's be frank, some questionable inclusions on
A
here.
lot of new names, right? 9 players that were either drafted in 2021 or 2022, which that's a lot of young players. I mean, we previewed Racing Louisville already, and we talked about their young roster and how they're bringing a lot of new players, but they're also a second year expansion side, and they. I don't know. It's just different when you have
Yeah.
a club like Chicago that is established, that's been around, it's been throughout the league. It's been here throughout the years. It's been a consistent playoff contender throughout the years, to now kind of have so many young new names on this roster and a lot of unsuspecting preseason roster signings and names listed here.
Yeah. I mean, just going through them, you could sort of have, like, whenever these preseason rosters get put out, there's always, the acronym list, the key that goes to it. So it's like NRI is like a non-roster invitee, NYR is not yet reported to camp, loan means loan, right? Et cetera, et cetera. So within this, for example, a player like Casey Krueger, one of these players that we're talking about, was one of the key re-signings, right, for this club.
Mhm.
Someone who announced at the sort of beginning stages of the off season her pregnancy with her husband, so they're expecting a new addition to their family. So a player who's, let's be real, largely going to be out or absent for the majority of the 2022 season. So that's a big defensive piece there. Going through even just this forward line, while they have a ton of players listed. Madison Haley was their top pick in the 2021 draft, a not yet rostered player. And then Kalia Watt, another not yet rostered player. Some extra reporting done on these two players specifically from Claire Watkins, confirming that Kalia Watt did in fact tear her ACL in the semifinal against Portland Thorns. So she will be out. She's currently in the process of rehabbing on her own in her own market. And then a player like Madison Haley, who out of Stanford, this club was very high on, is not yet reported either, but they do not have any additional information as to the reasons why. So whether it's injury related or otherwise, but this is a player who is not, as of this time, currently involved in camps, but they listed her as part of the roster. So a lot of things within that. Players who are on loan. We talked a little bit about, like you said, Sarah Luber on loan, and this goes a little bit in line with what you were talking about with Katie Johnson to San Diego Wave in terms of
Yeah.
the depth of this forward line. Like, what is this forward line even going to look like, right, in 2022, Lisa?
And how many of these players have experience, right? Like, that's the other thing. I mean, adding Yuki Nagasato is huge for this Chicago team because she has experience. She has a lot of um, experience at the international level, Japanese international, played in World Cups, won a lot at that level. She also has a lot of experience professionally in the NWSL, and she has experience with Chicago Red Stars, which gives her that leg up. She's also like a fan favorite. So fans love her and fans want to see her. She's good in the locker room. She's a crowd pleaser. She's a great personality, and she can score goals when she's on the pitch. So adding her back to the roster, that's a huge help in this front line. But as you mentioned, Madison Haley not being available as of yet, Kalia Watt out for injury this year, it makes it thinner. So losing Katie Johnson is a really huge loss. But when you look at the listed 12 forwards, now down to 10 with the loss of Haley and Watt, how many of them played last year for this team? Rachel Hill, Sarah Lubert, but on loan now, so not really. Alyssa Motts, she did get some time, and then Mallory Pugh. But not a lot there, not a lot of depth by any means. So when I do look at this front line, it's almost like the same old story for Chicago. They have to just rely on their midfield to get them through day in and day out, which will be interesting to kind of see as they approach 2022 and what they look to roll out formation and starting lineup wise in the start of the Challenge Cup.
I think it's important to take a look at the rosters that we've been doing for all of these previews and maybe sort of be able to pinpoint any holes or anything that are within that. But something else that we've been doing is we've been sort of pitching around the idea of like who can be in a starting 11, right? Based on all of the names that we see on a roster, because that's a part of the fun with preseason rosters is sometimes they could be really, really lengthy. But even with all of the new faces that are in this, I think you can go across and say, depending on the timeline of the season, because there are so many United States women's national team players who might be in and out, right, for World Cup qualifying matches, that maybe come opening day, if everybody's healthy, you could still maybe kind of point out some players and say these are likely locks, right, for starting 11 type of lineups. Someone like an Alyssa Nair, if everything's going great with her, rehab will likely be in net. And if not, honestly, Cassie Miller ended up sort of taking over the reins last year when she went out. Someone like a Tierna Davidson, obviously Aaron Wright, in terms of the back line and being able to provide leadership there. Midfielders as well. You still have the staple, right, of Colaprico, Di Bernardo, Gatra. And I think maybe when we're looking at teams, we've been saying this for a couple teams already on previews, perhaps the biggest opportunity there is on that forward line. So maybe an ideal starting 11 isn't one that we can nail down completely with 11 full players, but we can definitely talk about some areas that we're interested in terms of a young prospect to take a look at for this team moving forward, of which there are many, right, Lisa? I think for young prospect to keep an eye on for Chicago Red Stars could be a player in Jill Aguilera. This is a player that actually didn't declare for the draft. Coming out of Arizona, representing with the Wildcats, a program that was able to make it into the college cup rounds and really kind of make names for themselves. But this was someone who got picked off of waivers, essentially didn't actually declare for the draft. So this can almost perhaps be a little bit of a steal, right, for the Chicago Red Stars. And I mean, when we're looking positionally, going to be competing for one of these forward positions, right? So, in terms of her getting into the mix and her trying to, make a name for herself, work alongside and stand out to the current coaching staff in place, this is maybe a player who could potentially, at the very least, maybe crack the roster for this team.
I'm definitely looking at Jill Aguilera. Also, I'm looking at 2022 draft pick Samantha Fisher, Sammy Fisher out of Notre Dame. She was the 19th overall pick for Chicago this offseason. California native, but she's in the Midwest at Notre Dame and now heading to Chicago. She's, although a midfielder, and the midfield for Chicago has been pretty much solidified over the last few years. I think this is a player that we could also see on the front line because she does have a tendency to score a lot of goals. She's a very creative player, likes the ball at her feet. She scored 29 goals and 15 assists during her collegiate career. So this is a player that can maybe step into that role. I don't know how much time she'll get this season specifically, but there are injuries that happen, and she is a player in Fisher that could be that next man up mentality player that could slot in. And if she really tries to learn everything she can from Di Bernardo, Colaprico, Sarah Waldmo even, and Morgan Gautrat in the midfield, it could be a future player for Chicago, because that's a lot of times what the Red Stars like to do, bring in a young player, mold them, and train them into being one of the regulars in the middle of the park for Chicago. So I'm taking a look at Sammy Fisher as a young player as well, but there's a lot of experienced players as well on this one. It's almost like there's experience and then young players, and the middle is a little bit of a mix, which makes it hard to almost talk about like a breakout player. But when you look at all of the experience that Chicago has, who needs to step up and who needs to really take this team on their shoulders and be the one to pull it all together?
I mean, there's a number of players that you could look at as that sort of essential, experienced player for the Red Stars because they've got a core of them who have still been with the team anywhere from 2015, 2016 draft classes. But I'm gonna go with Aaron Wright on this one. This is a player who is coming off of a very strong 2021 season, maybe under the radar a little bit, quite frankly, in light of having somebody like a Sarah Gorden go out there and have the season that she had with Chicago, picking up Iron Woman for them. But Aaron Wright is a player for the Red Stars that we had seen in the past really predominantly be at that outside position in recent seasons, be utilized as kind of a utility player and play all over the pitch. At times was pushed up higher across the forward line. The part of the club after 2019 to have her pregnancy and then welcome a baby into the mix and welcoming baby Grady into her life, and came back and had to work her way back from having giving birth and recovering back to the lifestyle of a pro athlete, and really went ahead and just went out there and did what she did in 2021. We're talking about all the way through, almost very nearly, Lisa, I don't know if you recall, but almost getting an equalizer in that
Yeah.
final against the Spirit off the post, right? So just someone who has been that player for the Red Stars that they can kind of point to and say, yes, like you've been here, you know what it's about. And she can sort of give that leadership. She can sort of give that experience to, quite frankly, maybe anyone positionally, having had the experience, yes, predominantly on the defensive side of things,
Yeah.
but really all over the pitch for Chicago. So if I'm looking for someone to maybe be that kind of essential experience player for the Red Stars, I'm looking at Aaron Wright.
Me too. Aaron Wright is the great pick for that, especially in losing Sarah Gorden in the back line. Just everything that you mentioned all over the pitch, she can provide in the locker room. She can provide. It definitely someone that the team needs to lean on. And I think that Aaron Wright needs to take that mindset of I'm going to be a leader and I am going to step up vocally on the pitch, off the pitch, in the training room and everything like that. She needs to grab that, take it, and just own her leadership ability out this year. With that in combination, maybe for Chicago, I'm getting more amped about them for this year the more we talk about them, because I'm not going to lie, when I looked at their offseason trades and everything, I wasn't that excited about what the prospects were to come.
I don't think that's unfair. I think a lot of people are maybe looking at Chicago in a similar lens, right? Coming off of an offseason that they did, going into preseason, what are they going to bring, right? International spotlight, maybe a little bit different from some other teams, but they are going to be missing United States national team players. There's already players involved in She Believes Cup right now with someone like Alyssa Nair, Turner Davidson, Morgan Gautrat, and Mallory Pugh. And as the year continues to roll out, obviously we'll keep an eye on that. If those players are still constantly called in to part of national team camps, that's going to impact
Mhm.
Chicago and their season, which honestly, Lisa, perhaps leads us to our biggest burning question entering the 2022 season for Chicago Red Stars. Can Chicago continue their legacy as the league continues to grow? Can this team keep up with the league as it continues to expand? Will this be the first year Chicago doesn't make the playoffs in 7 straight years? So maybe a number of questions, right? Instead of just one burning question. Can the Red Stars keep up as the league continues to evolve?
I think this question is crucial for this team because they have been a powerhouse. I mean, not the burning powerhouse. I think when you look back historically, a lot of players or a lot of fans would say Portland Thorns stands out as a powerhouse. But Chicago has always been there. They've always been a contender. They've been competition. They've always been really tough to break down defensively. They can always score goals upon you. So can they continue to do that and match the competition in the league as it grows, as teams get better, as there's more competition? I think it's going to be hard for them. They cannot do the same thing that they've done the last 5 or 6 seasons and expect to make the playoffs. They have to change it up. They have to do different things. They have to maybe rely on some younger players. They have to have bigger rotations in their substitutions that are happening during play. A lot of times in the past, Chicago's been almost stingy with their substitutions. They get players and they play 80 90 minutes games, and that's it for the season. And that's why they are so good, because they can mesh so well together. But when you don't have that depth, especially in the front line, providing different looks in the attack for your team, you lose a little bit of your gumption against opponents, and your that you really need, especially as the league continues to grow. It's actually a shorter season in 2022 than it was just looking at 2021, but there's more competition. So one home game, one away game. And when you add in two clubs like San Diego Wave FC and Angel City that are doing everything in their power, especially to build a powerhouse team, and Chicago's just kind of sitting there looking to do the same old thing that they've done in the past, it's not going to be enough. So I want to see something different from Chicago so they can keep up and stay with the times and keep evolving as one of the top clubs in this league, which maybe leads us to our projected finish for 2022, Sandra. I mean, we listed them at 8 back in December, way back when, our way too early power rankings. After we talk through this, we look at their roster, we dive deep, we find the holes, and we poke at them. We look at the young players, the experienced players. What are you thinking for their finish in 2022?
Listen, I don't know how we can go off of what we just went through and maybe change that up. I think it's very, it's very obvious, and perhaps maybe a little bit of recency bias in that, going through their off season, you're like, they're not going to go anywhere. And to be quite frank, there was a little bit of that narrative around the team during 2021. We heard a lot about this team in 2021, seeing it on people's reactions to the team and how they played, like, oh, this team is boring, or they're not the same team anymore, or what are they going to do? And then all of a sudden, they found themselves in another championship final towards the end, just based off of pure and sheer belief in each other and just getting it done on the pitch. So is it maybe a little unfair that you and I are going to come on here and say maybe the 2021 runners up are going to have this massive fall from grace, but that's part of the job, right? So I think to keep them honest and to keep it Chicago, you got to work until you earn. So to keep them honest, I think we are going to keep them in the 7 to 9 range. I think an ambitious finish for them in light of an expanded league would maybe be a low playoff spot, maybe a 5 or 6. So maybe they still surprise folks, or still stay in the mix. But I think keeping them where we had them, I think is fair for right now. Would love to be proven wrong though.
I don't think that's unfair to say. I mean, and frankly, like, I would not be surprised if they make the playoffs again in 2022, but I think it's going to be a lot harder than it has been in the past for Chicago. So I give them a low playoff spot as well, maybe 5, 6, maybe 6, 7, 8, keeping them in that range. We'll see. We'll see. They do have experienced players, which helps, but with CONCACAF W Championship happening in the summer and them losing a lot of their United States women's national team players, that's going to hurt them throughout the
Yes,
year.
it
That's
will.
why they've got to have a deep bench. I mean, it's full circle. Everything, all the points I'm making, honestly connect to each other. So we'll see. Let's keep them honest. 7, 8, 9th spot, right out of playoff range for now.
It's a new era for NWSL. We'll see how it shakes out for Chicago and if they could keep up. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Chicago Red Stars 2022 preview. We've got full team by team previews for all 12 clubs in the NWSL coming up. Stay tuned for more. Drop us your thoughts about Chicago Red Stars on Twitter at Attacking Third, or in the comments if you subscribe to YouTube at youtube.com/Attacking Third. But don't go anywhere. We have an exclusive interview with Chicago's midfielder Daniel Colaprico right after this break.